was barren, and through a miracle she conceived. Rebecca was barren, through a miracle she conceived. And the same with Leah and Rachel. They were both barren, and through a miracle they conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, why am I like this?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Interesting, she's got this sort of commotion going on inside of her. And who does she ask? She goes to God, and she prays and says, "God, what's going on here?" And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two people shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. He was like a red little monkey. So they called his name Esau, which means red. Afterwards his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so that his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with the same red stew." So the red, hairy dude wants some red stew from his brother. "Look, I'm about to die. So what is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Some of your birthright as of this day. So I'll give you some of the stew if you sell your birthright to me here now." And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. So what is the birthright to me?" Then Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank and arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So maybe let's just start off and compare these two brothers, Jacob and Esau. And there are two microphones, one with Nelson, one with Don, so you can just put up your hand if you want to make a comment or contribute. So the one was smooth, the other one was hairy. The one probably had black hair, the other one red. And not just on his head. He had the red hair all over. The one stayed at home, the other one was a hunter. What else? Pardon?
One despised the birthright, and the other looked for it.
Yes, and very interesting.
Yes.
Right up to the end, let's just talk about that, and we can jump around a bit when we talk about these two brothers. What was his concern? What was Esau's concern in the memory text? Was it the blessing or the birthright? It's not the birthright. He despised it. He said, and Esau said, "Is it not right? Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright." Not that he cared much about that. And now look, he has taken away my blessing. And he said, what did he say to his father? "Don't you have a birthright for me?" Or did he say, "No, don't you have a blessing for me?" He wanted the blessing. He couldn't care less about the birthright. Because the birthright was a spiritual right. Messiah would come from your descendants. That was what the birthright was all about. That was what occupied his mind. That was what was important to Jacob. To Esau, it was the blessing. And the blessing meant that he would get twice the amount of his father's inheritance. So he will get a double portion, and his brother will get a third. So he will get 2/3, and his brother will get a third. That's what he was interested in. Temporal things.
I feel sorry for Esau. Esau felt constricted. He felt claustrophobic. And when you read Ellen White, I remember years ago reading about Esau, and it was so interesting. And how far he ranged from home. He was gone for months. He saw territories that no one else had seen during that time. He lived a lifestyle of danger. Many times he should have been killed on the hunt. And so what was important to him was the blessing, and you hear that cry come out from him. But haven't you reserved a blessing for me? I know I've lost the birthright, never wanted that, never cared. Jacob thought he was tricking me out of it, but I didn't really care. But can I not have a blessing? So I feel a bit sorry for Esau.
Yes, and partly that was because of his father. So Jacob was the mommy's boy. And yes, if Esau was the man's man. He wasn't the mommy's boy. And, typically those two personality types don't really befriend each other. So they weren't really, I think, friends. But his father, irrespective of what the angel said to his mother, that the younger will have the birthright and that the older will serve the younger, and irrespective if Esau couldn't care less about the birthright, because he was Isaac's favorite son. Isaac loved him. He loved him more than the Bible says. Isaac loved Esau. Rebecca loved Jacob. So he loved his son, and irrespective of who said what, he wanted to give him the birthright and the blessing because he was the oldest. And he just loved him.
Yeah, it's interesting that it was prophesied by the angel when he spoke to Rachel. But what intrigues me is when Esau said, "I'm going to die," is that because he was tired from hunting all day, or was it because of his age, or because he realized he lost that spiritual aspect, or we're going to lose that spiritual aspect of his birthright?
Yes, so when we read Patriarchs and Prophets, Esau was very focused on the here and now. Temporal things. It's just like, what's important to me is what's happening today. Jacob, on the other side, thought of the future. He planned his life according to the future. He looked forward to the Messiah. He didn't understand it very well because he didn't have an experiential relationship with God at that point in time. That only came after he sinned. But he knew there was something important that was going to happen based on the prophecy from the angel. And he wanted to be part of it. He wanted that for himself. Yes, David.
I was just going to say that also, you can imagine the morning Abraham wakes up and he calls for his son. Now, there was only like 3 seconds difference between when these kids popped out. So Esau comes out, he's seconds later, but sorry, the other way around, either way, but he calls for his son, and we've got to remember that in the background is Rebecca, and she's listening, and she's got a plan. So this isn't just something that Jacob came up with. She goes and gets him, tells him it's time, she dresses him up, he's got all the questions, but I don't feel like, who am I talking about? Esau. I don't feel like Esau. My skin doesn't feel the same. I'm a different person. And so she's got the plan to dress him up so he feels like it. And from what you read in Patriarchs and Prophets, Rebecca actually pushed Jacob into that scenario.
Yep.
So Jacob walks in there with his mum pressing him from behind again. And the reason I'm saying this is due to your comment that you said earlier. He's still the mummy's boy. And he's still doing what he's told.
Yep. And before we are too hard on Rebecca, why did Rebecca actually do this? Well, we know that to an extent she wanted to protect Isaac, her husband, because there was a prophecy from God that said the younger will rule and the older will serve the younger will get the birthright. And she saw her husband, because of his love for Esau, sort of wandering off the path, away from the prophecy. And she didn't want God to be, upset with what the husband was doing. So the end, do we say, justify the means? So she thought, okay, wait, God, it's clear you need some help now, because this husband of me is straying off the path. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take it upon myself, and I'm going to help you. And I'm going to use the devil's methods to do your work.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. It happened just a little bit before with Sarai. I'm going to give God a hand. I get Hagar to do what I meant to be doing. So isn't it interesting?
Yes. And I'm actually encouraged when I read these passages, because these were the heroes of faith, the families of faith. And in the beginning, on their journey with God, they didn't show much faith. It was actually later on in their lives, through an experiential relationship with God, that they realized, you know what, I can sit back and I can relax and I can let God work on my behalf. Nelson?
Yes, Chris, I would just like to add that these two brothers have some contrast between Esau and Jacob. Esau is more on a worldview perspective, while Jacob was more on a biblical worldview perspective. So when Rebecca saw that this was the worldview, the biblical worldview of Jacob, he tended to help Jacob plot for him to get the blessing, rather than Esau, who's really going to be wandering away from the prophecy, as you mentioned earlier.
And maybe just on that point as well, one of the other things that we saw is that Jacob didn't marry. He waited because they weren't supposed to marry the heathen, the idol worshippers. Where his brother on the other side says, once, twice, I'll get 2 idol worshippers and I'll marry both of them. Later on, we see that actually, I don't know if that's going to come out in next week's lesson, that one of Jacob's wives, the pretty one, the one that he loved, was the one that stole her father's idols. Okay, so yeah.
Chris?
Yes, Don.
So when you read the story of Sarah and how she wanted to assist God's plan, and we go to this one and we see how Rebecca tried to, or actually assisted God's plan. We see this sovereignty of God in that when He's independent. So for us, we would think, no, but then in the previous verses, we just read of a person that tried to help God and they did not succeed. And then in this case, we see somebody who is directing a prophecy and putting a hand in the prophecy, and then it's succeeding. So we just see that God can do what He wants, when He wants, and however He wants. Yeah.
Yes. In spite of us, God still leads, and His will be accomplished in the end. And then Galatians 6 verse 7, we read, what you sow, you will reap. And because of what Jacob did, and it's interesting, his brother was willing to wait for his father to die and then to kill him. So once again, showing his character traits. But because of what Jacob did, and because of the conspiracy between him and his mom, he had to leave home and he never saw her again. And the other thing I find quite interesting about this whole story is that Isaac thought that he was about to die, and that's why he wanted to give the blessing to Esau. But he didn't die. He still lived for many years. Many years. When Jacob came back after many years, after serving his crooked uncle for 21 years. His father was still alive. Once again, there was enough time in God's plan to have the prophecy being fulfilled without the assistance or help of human beings. So let's move on to Monday, Jacob's ladder. And I'm not sure why we call it Jacob's ladder, but maybe to an extent it is nice. Because the ladder, and if we read what Jesus says to Nathanael in John chapter 1, verse 51, I think it is, he says, you will see the angels of God descend upon the Son of Man. So we know the ladder is symbolic of Jesus. Jesus links heaven with earth. And what are some of the interesting things that came out for you about this ladder? What about the fact that he called that place Beth-El? Beth, we know, means house, because we've got Bethlehem, which means house of bread. We've got Bethsaida, house of mercy. And here we've got Beth-El, and El is God, the house of God. And it's interesting that you've got the ladder that extends from heaven to earth. And the lesson reminds us that just a few chapters previous, once again we get to man. And man thought, well, we need to build something that can extend from earth to heaven. Okay. The difference between the two was the one started from the earth, and did it reach heaven? Didn't even come close. All it created was confusion and separation of nations or of peoples. The other one extends from heaven to earth. And it's symbolic that on this ladder, who do we find on the ladder? What does the Bible say? Is it just a ladder or a staircase? No, angels descending up and down the ladder. So through Christ, we have the ministration of angels in contact with God, because right at the top of the ladder is God the Father standing there, and we are at the bottom. And Christ enables that whole process of the angels ministering to us. Now, how do we get to God? Why is it a ladder? When Ilona and I went to Germany for a holiday, and if you're in Berlin, as you say in English, there's the Siegersäule, I think it's called. And then it is the victory column. It's a big, big tower. And right on top of the tower is a golden angel. And you can climb to the top of it. It's got a spiral staircase inside. But it takes some time. And there are little stone benches that you can sit and you climb and climb and climb, and you're a man. So I don't want to associate myself with Jacob. I've never been a mommy's boy. I want to be a man's man. I'm not saying I am, but so it doesn't matter what your legs feel like. Doesn't matter that you've probably walked 15 kilometers all over Berlin that day. You climb those stairs, and when you get to a little bench, you don't even look at it. You don't need it. You just keep on climbing. And sometimes you see a lady or even a young guy sitting there, and you're just like, whatever. You just keep on climbing. But, that lactic acid starts sort of building up in your legs. and it gets harder and harder to get to the top because you're not resting. And when I read the story about Jacob, I was thinking about me climbing to the top. And the Americans in the Second World War, when they got to Berlin and they saw this high tower with the angel on it, they called it the chick on the stick. And to this day, that's what the Americans probably call it. But when I read about this ladder, Christ, how do I get to God? Is it trying to run up that ladder as fast as I can? Or is it taking one step at a time? Testing Him. I don't know about you, but I don't just jump on the ladder. If I put my foot on the first rung, I first just feel, is this thing stable? Because I've heard about stories of people falling off ladders. I don't want to do that. So, you put your foot on Christ, and you just test Him. Okay? And then you put another foot, and another foot. And sometimes you just stand where you are. You don't move. But you remain on Christ. You don't get off the ladder. Don't jump off the ladder. Don't turn around and start walking backwards. And who's there to support you while you're going on this journey? Who's walking with you up and down the ladder? Well, Jesus is the ladder, yes. And the angels. Mariana. Anna-Maria.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was just thinking, when you look at that, what you said in Berlin, right? You have benches to look out. And that is beautiful. You see that in other parts of Germany as well. And when you look out, you can look down. And what you described, you got to look down and look back how Jesus led you in the past. And that's where we learn to recreate, if you've lost a little bit of faith, recreate the faith we have in Him.
Excellent point. Thank you very much for that. And you're so right. I mean, it would have been just a much more, greater experience, I think, if I had just stopped at those benches, just sat, just looked what I had accomplished, and then climbed a bit further, rather than trying, to get to the end goal. And sometimes we just need to sit back, and it actually comes out in the lesson as well. We need to sit back and contemplate what God has done for us.
Hey, Chris, I would just like to add some comments on our teacher's lesson. It says here that the lesson of Bethel is that access to God can be achieved only through God's gift, through His grace and incarnation, through the ladder of Jesus Christ. Jacob's religion, significantly, is on this stone, the place where the ladder stands, that Jacob finds religion. Jacob identifies this stone as God's house. The stone means the assurance of the connection between heaven and earth.
Yes. The stone also symbolic of Christ, the cornerstone of the church, of whom we are all part. We are all living stones of that church. Let's move on. So, unlike his father, Jacob, or unlike his father's servant, Jacob arrives at his uncle with nothing, just his staff. Fleeing for his life, he comes to a pit, and there he sees a girl, and her name is Rachel. And I don't know if it was love at first sight, because it took him a month to decide and to ask Laban for his daughter's hand. Okay. And he helps her to open up the pit, the well, and to water her animals. And then they start talking, and he explains who he is, and she realizes it's a cousin. And she takes him home to her father, and the father's just so happy to see him because it's his sister's son. And then, as Galatians says, what you sow, you will reap. Then the experiential relationship with God begins with Jacob, through his uncle and his cousins. And not just the two cousins that he married, but their brothers as well. So, what stood out for you in this whole relationship between Jacob, Laban, his uncle, and his two wives, Leah and Rachel? I made a note that Jacob is starting to eat his own dog food. And as you said, Dave, it was his mother that enticed him and said, okay, let's, I got a plan. It seems like it ran in the family. Because his uncle as well, it's like, oh, I got a plan for Jacob. I'm going to enrich him. This is a very industrious young lad. He knows how to make money. I need to keep him close to me. Yeah. And then a month after his arrival, Jacob, his uncle says to him, listen, you need to stay here. How do I keep you around? And he says, well, your younger daughter, how about her? And nothing wrong with that. He didn't have a penny to his name. So Laban said to him, okay, happy. You worked 7 years, and then you can have her. What Laban didn't do is actually that dowry that was collected over the 7 years, he didn't give that to Rachel or to Leah for the 7 years. That's how it was supposed to work. He kept that money for himself. So in effect, that's why Jacob later on said to his uncle Laban, you sold your two daughters to me, because he didn't give them the dowry that Jacob had worked. And the reason this happened is someone couldn't just walk off the street and take your daughter away from you. He had to prove either that he already had enough wealth to take care of her, or you could arrange that he could work to gain that wealth, and then once he had gained it, you would give it to your daughter so that he could take care of her. And that was the arrangement in those days. But yeah, he lets Jacob work for him for 7 years. And what does the Bible say? How long did it feel like for Jacob? Like one day. It was nothing for him. So, he was like, he wasn't a young guy. He was like in his 30s, I think. But he was so in love with Rachel. They were so in love. Like the 7 years just flew past, and the next thing it was time to get married. Now, we're not going to try and understand or explain how after 7 days of feasting, his uncle, who is now his father-in-law, managed to swap his two daughters, and Jacob woke up the next morning and didn't know what happened. It's like, I don't know. Yeah. Any case. Love is blind. It must have been one day in heaven we'll understand how all of that happened. But the Bible says that he loved Rachel, but he did not love Leah. And sometimes we think that is actually so unfair. We know Rachel was beautiful, Leah was plain, the Bible says. But part of the reason why that happened is because she conspired with her father. Huh? No one could force her to do what she did. Once again, here we see, it's like, we're not going to wait on God. I got a plan. And given, I think a father was sort of the kind of overbearing parent that sort of manipulated her and said to her, listen, Leah, have you recently looked at yourself? You're never going to get a husband. So I've got a plan. I don't know what he did. But somehow she said, okay, Dad, let's do this. Next morning, Jacob wakes up, he says to his father, what have you done to me? Funny. And then they agree that he would marry Rachel. And yeah, the flimsy excuse, no, the oldest need to marry first, from the father. We know it's all just, talk. He says, okay, in 7 days you can marry Rachel, but you need to work another 7 years for her. So they have another feast, marries Rachel, and works 7 years for her. And what happens then? All big one, happy family, that's... No, not at all. Once again, both sisters are barren. And it's interesting that the first sister to pray to God says, my husband doesn't love me. Maybe if I bear him sons or bore him sons, he would love me. Is Leah. So Leah prays to God. And how many sons does God give her? 4 in a row. The other thing we need to keep in mind about Leah is maybe she wasn't the favorite wife, but through whom did the Messiah come? Through a 4th son, Judah. Exactly right. Who did Jacob, when he was about to die, who did he say, who did he want to be buried with? Leah. Said where Leah's buried, that's where you need to go and bury me. So although Rachel was, and who was, as we mentioned earlier, who was the wife that actually stole her father's little idols? Yeah, okay, the pretty one that he loved. So it is, we get sort of the sense that he mellowed with age, and then he realized that maybe Leah was the better wife. Not Rachel. Okay, Rachel also died early on with the birth of Benjamin. But once again, it's encouraging. You have these dysfunctional individuals forming this dysfunctional family. When I look at this church, and I'm going to start with myself as a dysfunctional individual to some extent, and maybe some of you would put up your hands and say, I'm a bit dysfunctional myself. And maybe our church is a little bit dysfunctional. But through all of this dysfunction, there's a God that is in charge, and his purposes will eventually play out as he wants them to. His word will not return to him empty, but it will accomplish that which he has sent it out to do. And that shouldn't discourage us that we're dysfunctional, or we're struggling, or we're sinning, or we're forcing God's hand, or we're jumping ahead. Just at some point, whichever rung you are on that ladder, just stop, just stand, just wait. God will catch up to you. And then we can just move forward again. So then he starts working for his uncle. You have to give it to Jacob. God really changed his life. Long before he changed his name to Israel and his character. Changed his life at Bethel. He works for this father-in-law for 7 years, and how many times does his father-in-law change his wage? 10 times. So if I work and after, I work for commission, and I just make so much money for myself because I work on commission, and then after 6 months my boss comes to me and says, no, we need to fix your salary. No more commission for you. And because I'm taking too much money out of these profits. And then I work for this fixed salary. And after a while, maybe I'm not performing so well. And then he says, okay, no, we'll put you back on commission. Because he wants to save money. And he just keeps on swapping. I don't think I'm going to last long. I'm going to look for another boss. But he just sticks to it. And through that, he actually enriches his father-in-law. And it's interesting that after about 7 years of doing that, and his father-in-law became very rich, he became even richer. What does his brothers-in-law say about all of this? Patricia there? Nelson?
They thought it belonged to them.
Interesting, eh? He got there, he didn't have much. On the other side, his father-in-law didn't have much either. And those cousins of his, they didn't do much. I mean, I think they had their chance to help their father build up something before Jacob arrived, and they didn't. They did jack. So Jacob arrives, and through the blessing of God, he starts building up a nice stock for himself and for his father-in-law. And then when he wants to leave, or when he becomes rich, his brothers-in-law say to him, like, this is all our father's stuff that you've taken from him. And he realized trouble. And he wasn't the kind of person that, he would rather flee than fight. And he prayed about it. Interesting. He prays about it. He says, God, my father-in-law's attitude has changed towards me. My brothers-in-law are hostile. What do I need to do? And God says, it's time to go. It's time to leave. And then the lesson talks about this. When do we know it's time to leave? How do we know when we need to stay put in any situation, or if we need to leave? Do you want to say? Nelson?
Yes. It's time to leave when God tells you to leave.
Simple as that. It's as simple as that. You pray about it, and you pray about it, and at some point in time, God will impress you. No, stay a little bit longer, or it's time to leave. It's time to leave. Then Jacob leaves. And what does his father-in-law do? Cunning as always. He uses his daughters and his grandchildren as an excuse. He says, it's like my favorite daughters. It's probably only to add. And all my favorite grandchildren. And while I'm away, you just take all of them, you're up and you just leave. It took him 3 days to realize that his favorite daughters and favorite grandchildren had left. It took him 7 days to catch up to them. And he didn't catch up with them on his own. He took like a fighting party with him because he wanted to bring them back by force. And what happened the night before he caught up with Jacob? Yeah, the dream. You see, and that's just exactly what happens. So Jacob doesn't know, does he need to move or not? He goes to God. God says, it's time to go. So now he's in the path of God. He is finding himself and his whole family in the will of God. So now God can fight on his behalf. So now if somebody chases him, God appears to that person in a dream and says to him, listen, you keep away from Jacob. If you harm him, we're going to have some trouble. And Laban's like, backs off. Okay. He was a bit of an idol worshipper because it was these idols that his daughter stole. But still, when God appears to him in a dream, he's like, okay, God, all good. And he reconciles with Jacob. And they put up a monument and they say, I won't move past this monument, and you must not move past this monument with any ill intent in your heart towards me. And they have a big feast, and after the big feast, they separate their ways. Any other thoughts that anyone wants to share with us? We've got 1.5 minutes left.
All our disturbances with family disturbances and troubles, God always intervenes if you're right with Him.
Yes, exactly right. So, as we said, we've got a spiritual dysfunctional family, we've got biological dysfunctional families, maybe where we come from. But even in our biological families, everyone doesn't need to serve God for God's plans to work out according to His will. It's all we need is 1 or 2 people praying to God, and He will bring everything in line with His will. And He will take care of us wherever we find ourselves in those families. But as a church family, what we need to do is encourage one another to get onto the ladder. Grab hold of that ladder. Stay on the ladder. Help each other up the ladder. Always realize that the angels of God are descending and ascending up that ladder. God and His angels are more keen to assist us on our way to heaven than what we are to actually get there. And I think that's quite encouraging. Thank you for your contributions. We're going to be taking up the offering, and then I'll just say a closing word of prayer. Thank you, Deacon and Deaconess.